Marcus Blackwood lived where civilization forgot to reach. His weathered hands had built everything around him from the timber he felled himself. The cabin stood like a fortress against the wilderness, its thick log walls chinked with moss and clay, windows small enough to keep the cold out, but large enough to watch for whatever might come from the tree line. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 37 years on this earth, and Marcus had learned that solitude was safer than trust. The mountains of northern Montana stretched endlessly in every direction, peaks crowned with snow even in summer, valleys carved deep by ancient glaciers. His nearest neighbor lived 80 miles south, and Marcus preferred it that way. The silence here wasn't empty, it was full of wind through pine needles, the distant call of hawks, the crack of settling timber in the cabin walls. Every morning, before dawn, Marcus would step onto his porch and breathe the thin mountain air. The ritual never changed. Coffee black as motor oil heated over the wood stove. A careful inspection of his tools, axe, crosscut saw, wedges worn smooth by countless hours of splitting. Then into the forest where Douglas fir and lodgepole pine grew straight and tall, waiting for his practiced eye to choose which would fall. The work was hard enough to quiet his thoughts. Swing after swing, the rhythm became meditation. When a tree crashed down, sending echoes bouncing off distant ridges, Marcus felt something close to peace. Not happiness, he'd given up on that particular luxury years ago, but a kind of acceptance. This was his life, simple, predictable. Safe. His cabin sat on 40 acres he'd bought with cash 12 years earlier, when he'd first fled to these mountains. No mortgage, no neighbors dropping by with casseroles, no phone lines stringing him back to a world he wanted to forget. The land had cost him nearly everything he'd saved, but it had given him something priceless in return, the right to disappear. The nearest town was Cedar Falls, population 847, according to the faded sign at the city limits. Marcus drove his battered Ford pickup down the mountain every 6 weeks or so, loading up on supplies at Hendrick's General Store: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition for his rifle, jerky and canned goods to supplement what he hunted, and the vegetables he grew in his small garden. The townspeople knew him by sight, but not by story, which was exactly how he liked it. Old Pete Hendrick would ring up his purchases with minimal conversation. "Storm coming in this week," Pete might say, or "Heard there's been a bear sign up your way." Marcus would nod, pay in cash, and drive back up the winding mountain road before anyone could ask questions. He didn't want to answer. The cabin itself told its own story of a man building a life from scratch. Hand-hewn beams supported the roof, each one shaped with the patient precision of someone who had nowhere else to be. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, built from river rock Marcus had hauled up the mountain one wheelbarrow load at a time. Shelves lined the walls, holding a modest collection of books, classics mostly, stories of men testing themselves against nature and finding out what they were really made of. A single bedroom held a simple bed frame he'd constructed from lodgepole pine, the mattress firm and practical. The kitchen was basic but functional: a wood-burning stove, open shelves for dishes, a hand pump that drew water from the well he'd dug himself. No electricity meant kerosene lamps when darkness fell, their warm yellow light casting dancing shadows. On the log walls, Marcus had arranged his life to need as little as possible from the outside world. Solar panels charged a small battery bank that powered a radio and a few LED lights. A root cellar dug into the hillside kept vegetables fresh through the winter. Meat came from the deer and elk he hunted, smoked and preserved in a shed behind the cabin. The garden provided potatoes, carrots, onions, and hardy greens that could survive the short growing season. Winter lasted 7 months this high in the mountains. Snow would pile 4 feet deep against the cabin walls, and for weeks at a time, the road down to town became impassable. Marcus had learned to prepare meticulously, stacking cordwood until it formed a wall taller than his head, preserving enough food to last until spring, checking and rechecking his supplies like a man preparing for siege. During those long winter nights, with wind howling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, Marcus would sometimes remember what his life had been before. The memories came whether he wanted them or not, usually when he was tired and his mental defenses were down. Images of another house, another life, people whose faces he tried hard not to see clearly in his mind's eye. He'd been different then, trusting, optimistic, foolish. He now understood. The world had taught him better through a series of lessons so brutal they'd driven him to these mountains, seeking a place where the past couldn't follow. Most nights he succeeded in keeping those memories at bay, but some nights they crept in like cold air through a crack in the wall. The morning routine helped. Physical labor helped more. There was honesty in the weight of an axe, in the straight grain of fresh-cut timber, in the simple equation of work performed and shelter built. Trees didn't lie. Storms didn't make promises they couldn't keep. The mountains didn't pretend to be something they weren't. Marcus had built more than just a cabin in these 12 years. He'd constructed an entire existence designed to need nothing from anyone. Self-sufficiency wasn't just a lifestyle choice. It was armor against a world that had already taken more from him than he could afford to lose. The scars on his hands told the story of learning, through trial and error. Building without blueprints, making mistakes and fixing them, slowly becoming the kind of man who could shape raw timber into shelter, who could read weather in cloud formations, who could track game by bent grass and disturbed leaves. The Marcus who had fled to these mountains had been broken. The Marcus who lived here now was harder, quieter, more careful, but intact. His daily schedule rarely varied. Up before sunrise, coffee and a sparse breakfast, then into the forest to work until his shoulders ached and sweat ran down his back despite the mountain cold. Lunch was often jerky and water consumed while sitting on a fallen log, listening to the forest sounds that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Afternoons meant different tasks depending on the season. In summer, he'd tend his garden, repair whatever needed fixing around the cabin, or hunt when the meat supply ran low. Fall brought the urgent work of preparation, cutting and splitting enough firewood to last the winter, preserving the gardens. Harvest, hunting for the meat that would see him through the months when snow made the forest impassable. Winter was the test. Weeks would pass when the only sounds were wind, falling snow, and the crack of timber in the fireplace. Marcus had learned to find peace in the isolation, to appreciate the fierce beauty of storms that bent trees nearly horizontal and painted every surface with ice. He read by lamplight, maintained his tools, and waited for spring with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. Spring always came as a surprise, even after 12 years. One day the snow would simply start melting faster than it fell, and streams would appear where none had existed, carrying the mountain's winter burden down toward distant valleys. The first green shoots pushing through brown earth felt like miracles, proof that life persisted even in the harshest places. The townspeople in Cedar Falls had long since stopped speculating about the hermit on the mountain. Marcus Blackwood was simply part of the landscape now, as reliable and unremarkable as the sunrise. He bought his supplies, minded his own business, and bothered no one. In a world full of complications, there was something almost admirable about a man who had stripped his life down to its essential elements. What they didn't know, what Marcus himself barely acknowledged, was the way solitude had slowly changed him. The sharp edges of his old anger had worn smooth, replaced by something deeper and more complicated. Not peace exactly, but a kind of hollow acceptance. He'd built a life that couldn't hurt him because it contained nothing worth losing. Mountains had taught him lessons about survival, about the difference between what he wanted and what he actually needed. The line between those two things had once seemed blurred, but 12 years of mountain living had made it crystal clear. He needed shelter, food, safety. Everything else was luxury, and luxury was dangerous because it could be taken away. On quiet evenings, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, Marcus would sometimes wonder if this was enough. If a life measured only in wood split and food preserved and winters survived could satisfy a man indefinitely. The question would rise like smoke from his evening fire, visible for a moment before dispersing into the vast Montana sky. But morning always came with its familiar demands, and the question would fade under the weight of necessary work. There were trees to fell, walls to maintain, preparations to make for the next winter that would surely come. The mountains were patient but unforgiving, and they demanded a man's full attention if he wanted to survive in their embrace. Marcus had learned to live with the silence, to find company in the steady presence of peaks that had stood for millions of years and would stand for millions more. If he sometimes wondered what it would be like to hear another human voice regularly, to share a meal or a conversation, he pushed such thoughts away with the same determination he used to swing his axe. The isolation was protection. The loneliness was the price he paid for safety, and it seemed a fair trade most days. He'd learned to fill the silence with work, to find purpose in the simple act of persisting. Day by day, season by season, year by year, Marcus Blackwood had built a life in the mountains that no one could touch because no one could reach it. But sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, he would remember what it felt like to care about someone else, to have someone care about him in return. Those memories were dangerous because they made the silence seem less like protection and more like punishment. On those mornings, it took longer for the familiar routine to chase away the ghosts, longer for the mountains to reassert their claim on his attention. Winter was coming again. Marcus could feel it in the angle of the sun, see it in the way the aspen leaves had begun their slow turn toward gold. Soon the first snows would dust the highest peaks, and the familiar cycle of preparation would begin. He would cut wood until his hands bled, preserve food until his root cellar overflowed, and settle in for another season of solitude. The mountains waited, patient and eternal, ready to test him once more. And Marcus Blackwood, alone in his fortress of logs and stone, would face that test as he had faced 11 others, with quiet determination and the hard-won knowledge that surviving was enough, that asking for more from life was a luxury he could no longer afford. The October morning broke gray and bitter, with clouds hanging low between the peaks like dirty wool. Marcus had woken before his usual time, disturbed by dreams he couldn't quite remember, but that left him restless and irritated. The coffee tasted burnt, the fire in the stove wouldn't draw properly, and even his most reliable axe felt awkward in his hands. He'd been working the north slope since dawn, felling mature pines for the winter's final push of firewood preparation. The rhythm should have calmed him, but something felt off about the day. The forest was too quiet. Even the usual chatter of squirrels and distant bird calls seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. By mid-morning, when the sun should have burned through the cloud cover, the sky had only grown darker. Marcus paused his work and studied the horizon. Weather moved fast in the mountains, and he'd learned to read the signs. This storm would be bigger than the forecast had suggested, the kind that could dump 3 feet of snow and close the road to Cedar Falls for a week or more. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was securing his tools in the lean-to shelter he'd built for equipment when he heard it. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a wounded deer or an elk calf separated from its mother. But the sound came again, and it was unmistakably human. A voice, thin and desperate, calling out somewhere beyond the tree line. Marcus froze, his hand still gripping the handle of his crosscut saw. In 12 years on the mountain, no one had ever come this far up the old logging road. The few hunters who ventured into this territory stayed on the main trails, And they certainly didn't travel alone this late in the season. The voice came again, weaker now and definitely female. Young from the sound of it. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. His first instinct was to ignore it, to go back to his cabin and let whoever it was figure out their own problems. He'd come to these mountains specifically to avoid other people's troubles, but the voice carried such desperation that it cut through his carefully constructed indifference. Against his better judgment, Marcus found himself walking toward the sound, his boots crunching through the frost-brittle undergrowth. He found her about a quarter mile from his cabin, collapsed beside a boulder that jutted up from the forest floor like a broken tooth. She couldn't have been more than 17, maybe 18 at most. Her clothes were wrong for the mountains, a thin jacket that might have been adequate for a city autumn, but was useless against the high-altitude cold. Jeans torn at the knees, sneakers that were soaked through and caked with mud. She was shivering so hard she could barely speak. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that Marcus recognized as the early stages of hypothermia. But what struck him most was her obvious pregnancy. She was far along, maybe 8 months, her belly straining against a sweater that looked like it had once belonged to someone much larger. "Please," she managed through chattering teeth when she saw him. "I've been walking. I don't know how long. My car ... went off the road." Marcus crouched down beside her, his mind racing through possibilities. The main road was 15 miles away. The old logging road that led to his property was barely passable even in good weather, and it had been gated and officially closed. For years, how had she gotten this far? And why was a pregnant teenager driving alone in the mountains with winter weather moving in? "Where's your car?" he asked, scanning the tree line for any sign of a vehicle. "Down the hill," she pointed with a shaking hand toward a steep slope covered in dense forest. "It slid ... I tried to get it out, but..." Her voice trailed off as another wave of shivering took over. Marcus studied her face. She had the kind of pale skin that showed every mark, and he could see faint bruises around her wrists, partially hidden by the sleeves of her jacket. Her dark hair was matted and dirty, as if she'd been sleeping rough for more than just the night. Whatever her story was, it was more complicated than a simple car accident. The wind picked up, carrying the metallic scent of snow, Marcus calculated. Quickly, the temperature was dropping fast, and the girl was already hypothermic. Even if her car was drivable, which seemed unlikely given where she said it was, she wouldn't survive the night outdoors in her condition. "Can you walk?" he asked. She tried to stand but immediately swayed, her legs buckling. Marcus caught her before she could fall, feeling how thin she was beneath the oversized clothes. She was probably undernourished as well as cold. Without allowing himself to think too hard about what he was doing, Marcus lifted her in his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, all belly and bones. She didn't protest, which told him more about her desperation than any words could have. The walk back to his cabin felt longer than usual. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling words he couldn't make out. Once she said, "Mama," in a voice so lost and young that it made something twist painfully in Marcus's chest. By the time he reached the cabin, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. Large, lazy flakes that meant business. Marcus kicked open the front door and carried the girl straight to the fireplace, settling her in the old armchair he'd positioned there for the coldest nights. His movements were automatic, guided by knowledge he'd hoped never to need again. Strip away the wet clothes, wrap her in dry blankets, get her core temperature up gradually. He'd learned emergency medical care during his previous life, back when he'd cared about keeping people alive. The girl's eyes fluttered open as he was building up the fire. She seemed confused, looking around the cabin as if she couldn't quite figure out where she was or how she'd gotten there. "You're safe," Marcus said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. When was the last time he'd spoken those words to anyone? You have hypothermia. I need to warm you up slowly. She nodded weakly and pulled the blankets tighter around herself. Marcus heated water on the wood stove and made tea, adding honey and a splash of whiskey to help with the warming process. She drank it in small sips, her hands still shaking too badly to hold the cup steady. "What's your name?" Marcus asked when she seemed more alert. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Mitchell. How old are you, Sarah?" 17. She said it like an admission of guilt. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. 17, alone in the mountains with winter coming. Nothing about this situation was normal or innocent. "Where are you from?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, emotionless. "Billings, originally, but we moved around a lot. My mom and I," she paused, "and whoever my mom was with at the time." The way she said it told Marcus everything he needed to know about the kind of life Sarah had been living. He'd seen it before, in his old job kids who were more like possessions to be moved around and used by the adults who should have been protecting them. "How far along?" he asked, nodding toward her belly. "About 8 months, I think. Maybe more. I haven't exactly been to a doctor." Marcus poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. The storm was intensifying outside, wind rattling the windows and snow beginning to accumulate on the sills. Even if he'd wanted to take her back down the mountain immediately, it was no longer an option. "What happened to your car?" he asked. Sarah's eyes darted away from his. "I was driving up the old road. I guess I took a turn too fast. It was getting dark, and I couldn't see very well. The car just slid down the hill." It was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. Marcus had driven that road in all kinds of weather. It would take more than a simple turn taken too fast to send a car sliding down a mountain slope, but he didn't push. In his experience, the truth usually came out eventually when people were ready to tell it. "Why were you driving up here?" he asked instead. "This road doesn't go anywhere except to my property." Sarah pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "I was looking for somewhere to figure things out. I heard there were old cabins up here where nobody would bother me." Another partial truth, Marcus suspected. But looking at her so young, so obviously pregnant and alone, he decided the details could wait. The immediate problem was that he now had a pregnant teenager in his cabin with a major snowstorm moving in, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do about it. The practical part of his mind was already calculating supplies. He had enough food for one person to last the winter, but 2 people would stretch his resources thin. Medical supplies were basic. He could handle cuts and bruises, but delivering a baby was well beyond his capabilities. "And if there were complications, when's the baby due?" he asked. "Soon," Sarah said. "Maybe a few weeks. I'm not really sure." Marcus stared at her, not sure when her own baby was due. Either she was lying, or she'd had even less prenatal care than he'd suspected. Neither possibility was reassuring. The wind howled around the cabin, and Sarah flinched at the sound. "Is it going to be a bad storm?" "Bad enough," Marcus said. "We'll probably be snowed in for a few days at least." He saw panic flicker across her face. "I need to get back down the mountain. I can't stay here." "You're not going anywhere in this weather," Marcus said firmly. "Even if your car was drivable, which I doubt, the road will be impassable until the plows come through. And they don't plow the old logging road." Sarah's breathing became rapid and shallow. "You don't understand. I can't stay here. I have to keep moving." "Why?" Marcus asked. "What are you running from?" For a moment, Sarah looked like she might tell him. Her mouth opened, and he could see her struggling with the words. Then she seemed to remember herself, and the moment passed. "Nothing," she said. "I'm not running from anything. I just ... I don't like being trapped." Marcus studied her bruised wrists, her too thin frame. the way she kept glancing toward the door as if planning an escape route. Everything about her screamed of someone who'd been hurt, who'd learned to run before the next blow could fall. "Well, like it or not, you're trapped until this storm passes," he said. "Might as well make the best of it." He stood up and began preparing a simple meal canned soup heated on the wood stove. Bread he'd baked a few days earlier, preserved. Vegetables from his root cellar. Sarah watched him move around the kitchen, her eyes tracking his every movement with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly. The question caught Marcus off guard. Why was he helping her? His first instinct had been to ignore her cries for help, to let her solve her own problems. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Getting involved with other people's troubles was exactly what he'd come to the mountains to avoid. But, looking at her now so young and pregnant and obviously terrified, he couldn't have left her to freeze in the forest. Whatever his reasons for choosing isolation, they didn't extend to letting children die of exposure. "Because you needed help," he said simply. Sarah studied his face as if looking for the catch, the hidden motive. "People don't usually help for no reason. Maybe the people you've known," Marcus said. "But not all people are the same." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue either. They ate in relative silence, the storm raging outside and the fire crackling in the hearth. Marcus found himself stealing glances at her, trying to piece together her story from the limited clues she'd given him. 17 years old, pregnant, running from something or someone. No medical care, no real sense of when the baby was due. Bruises on her wrists and a deep-seated fear of being trapped. The pieces painted a picture that made Marcus's chest tight with anger he thought he'd left behind. After dinner, he set up a makeshift bed for her near the fireplace, using extra blankets and cushions to make it as comfortable as possible. Sarah settled into it gratefully, exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. "Thank you," she said quietly as Marcus banked the fire for the night. He nodded but didn't trust himself to speak. Having another person in his carefully ordered space felt strange and unsettling. The cabin that had been his sanctuary for 12 years suddenly felt too small, too intimate. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of blankets as Sarah shifted position, her quiet breathing, the way she occasionally whimpered in her sleep. Marcus lay awake in his bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to the storm. Snow was piling up against the windows, and the wind showed no signs of letting up. They would indeed be trapped for several days, maybe longer. He tried to tell himself that as soon as the roads were clear, he would drive Sarah down to Cedar Falls and let the authorities handle her situation. But even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't that simple. Something about her story didn't add up, and until he knew what she was really running from, he couldn't be sure that turning her over to the authorities would help rather than hurt her. Besides, she was obviously close to giving birth. What if the baby came while they were snowed in? Marcus had seen enough emergencies to know that childbirth could go wrong in 100 different ways, especially when the mother was as young and undernourished as Sarah appeared to be. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, Sarah cried out in her sleep. Marcus found himself listening, ready to go to her if she needed help. The protective instinct surprised him. He'd spent 12 years training himself not to care, not to get involved, not to feel responsible for anyone but himself. But Sarah Mitchell, with her bruised wrists and her frightened eyes and her swollen belly, had walked into his carefully constructed isolation and shattered it in the space of a single afternoon. Whether he liked it or not, he was involved now. The only question was how deep he was willing to let himself get pulled into whatever trouble she was carrying with her. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, sealing them in together until the weather decided to relent. And, in the firelight, Marcus Blackwood found himself caring about another person's welfare for the first time in 12 years, wondering what that meant for the safe, solitary life he'd built in the mountains. The night stretched ahead of them, full of uncertainty and the sound of wind and snow. But inside the cabin, the fire burned warm and steady, holding back the cold and the darkness for at least one more night. The storm raged for 3 days, transforming the world outside into an endless white void. Marcus had weathered countless mountain blizzards, but never with company. Sarah's presence changed everything about his carefully structured routine. She slept fitfully, often crying out from nightmares that left her shaking and wide-eyed in the firelight. During her waking hours, she moved through the cabin like a ghost, touching nothing without permission, apologizing for existing. On the second morning, Marcus discovered her trying to clean his already spotless kitchen with trembling hands, scrubbing plates that were already clean until her knuckles went white with effort. "You don't need to do that," he said gently. Sarah startled, nearly dropping the plate. "I'm sorry, I need to earn my keep. I can't just take it without giving something back." The desperation in her voice made Marcus pause. This wasn't politeness or gratitude, this was fear. The behavior of someone who'd learned that nothing came free, that survival meant constantly proving your worth. "You're recovering from hypothermia," Marcus said. "Rest is what you need to do." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She quickly wiped away. "Please don't make me leave. I know I'm a burden, but I promise I can be useful. I can cook, clean, whatever you need. I can't go back down there." "Not yet." The raw terror in her words stopped Marcus cold. "Not won't go back, can't." As if something waited for her down in the civilized world that was worse than being trapped on a mountain with a stranger. "Why can't you go back?" he asked carefully. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly, a protective gesture that spoke volumes. "It's complicated. I've got time," Marcus said. "And we're not going anywhere until this storm passes." For a moment, Sarah looked like she might tell him everything. Then her face closed off again, shutters slamming down behind her eyes. "I just need some time to figure things out." Marcus didn't push, but he filed the reaction away. Sarah Mitchell was running from something specific, something that terrified her more than being alone and pregnant in a mountain blizzard. And whatever it was, it had something to do with her unborn child. That afternoon, while Sarah napped by the fire, Marcus ventured outside to check his generator and clear snow from the cabin's vents. The storm was finally beginning to ease, but they were buried under nearly 4 feet of fresh powder. It would be days before the main roads were passable, longer before anyone could reach his property. When he returned to the cabin, he found Sarah awake and staring at something in her hands. As he got closer, he could see it was a cell phone, old, with a cracked screen, but apparently still functional. "No signal up here," Marcus said, hanging his coat by the door. Sarah nodded, but she kept staring at the phone's dark screen. "That's probably for the best. Are people looking for you?" Marcus asked. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "Someone might be. Someone who shouldn't find you." She looked up at him then, and Marcus saw something break open in her expression. The careful wall she'd been maintaining crumbled just a little, revealing the frightened child underneath. "My mother," Sarah whispered. She's not a good person." Marcus sat down across from her, recognizing the moment when someone's story was finally ready to spill out. He'd learned patience during his years on the mountain, learned to wait for truth to emerge at its own pace. "Tell me," he said simply. Sarah was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she'd changed her mind. Then she began speaking in a voice so low he had to strain to hear her. "She sold me," Sarah said. "My own mother sold me to a man named Vincent Carrera, for drugs and money, mostly money. She said I was getting too expensive to keep around, especially with a baby coming." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd suspected abuse, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. When did this happen? 3 weeks ago, Vincent. He runs girls, young ones mostly. He has a house outside Billings where he keeps them. He said after the baby was born, I'd be worth more. Said pregnant girls were a specialty market, but ones who'd had babies were even more valuable because men knew they could ... Sarah's voice broke. I can't even say it. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, a hot, familiar fury that he'd thought he'd left behind years ago. The same anger that had consumed him before he'd fled to these mountains. The kind that made him want to break things, to hunt down monsters and make them pay for the damage they'd done. How did you get away? He managed to ask. Vincent had to go to Denver for some business. He left me with this woman, Rita, who watches his house. She's not mean, exactly. Just broken. She's been with Vincent for years, and I think she sees herself in the girls he brings in. Sarah paused, touching her belly again. Rita told me Vincent was planning to sell the baby, right after it was born. He already had buyers lined up, people who pay big money for newborns, no questions asked. She said once that happened, I'd never see my child again. That's when I knew I had to run. And your mother let this happen? Marcus's voice was carefully controlled, but Sarah must have heard the anger underneath because she flinched. She arranged it, Sarah said quietly. Vincent paid her $15,000 up front, with another $10,000 promised after the baby was born and sold. She drove me to his house herself. Marcus stood up abruptly and walked to the window, needing to put distance between himself and the story before his fury consumed his judgment. Outside, snow continued to fall, peaceful and silent, a stark contrast to the horror Sarah was describing. Mama has a problem, Sarah continued behind him. Opioids mostly, but she'd take anything she can get. She's been using it since I was little. After Dad died when I was 12, it got worse. We lost the house, moved into a series of apartments and motels. She'd disappear for days at a time, leaving me to figure out food in school and everything else. Marcus turned back to face her. How did you survive? I got good at stealing food, at lying to social workers, at making everything look normal from the outside. I learned to forge her signature on school forms and to call in sick for her at whatever job she was pretending to keep. By the time I was 15, I was basically taking care of both of us. The picture Sarah painted was devastatingly familiar to Marcus. He'd seen it too many times in his previous life. Children forced to become adults while their parents retreated into addiction. Families where the roles were completely reversed. How did you get pregnant? He asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Sarah's face went pale. There was this man, Derek, who Mama started seeing about a year ago. He was her dealer, but also ... more than that. He moved in with us, said he was going to take care of everything. But the way he looked at me ... double quotes, she shuddered. Mama knew. She had to know. But Derek was her connection, her supply, and she needed him more than she needed to protect me. Marcus felt something cold and murderous settle in his chest. He raped you multiple times, Sarah said, her voice flat and emotionless. Mama would disappear for days, and Derek would. He said I owed him for all the money he was spending on us. Said I needed to contribute to the household. When I found out I was pregnant, I tried to tell Mama, but she just got high and pretended she hadn't heard me. What happened to Derek? He overdosed about 6 months ago. Mama found him dead in the bathroom one morning. She was more upset about losing her dealer than losing her boyfriend. Sarah's laugh was bitter and broken. That's when things got really bad. Without Derek's protection, we owed money to his suppliers. Mama started turning tricks to pay for her drugs. Then Vincent showed up, offering a solution to all our problems. Marcus returned to his chair, his mind reeling. The scope of Sarah's trauma was staggering: abandonment, neglect, sexual abuse, trafficking. And through it all, the person who should have protected her had instead participated in her exploitation. That's why you can't go back, he said. Vincent will be looking for you. Sarah nodded. He has connections everywhere. Police, social workers, judges. People who look the other way for the right price. If I go back to any official place, hospital, police station, social services, word will get back to him eventually. And your mother? She needs that second payment. $10,000 is more money than she's ever seen at one time. She'll help Vincent find me if she has to. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Sarah had told him. The girl sitting across from him had survived more trauma than most adults could handle. And now she was facing motherhood completely alone, with predators hunting her and nowhere safe to turn. "How did you end up on my mountain?" he asked. "Rita helped me escape, but she said I had to get far away, somewhere Vincent would never think to look. She gave me an old car and what money she could spare, about $300. I drove north, staying off the main highways, sleeping in the car. I knew Vincent would expect me to head for a city, somewhere I could disappear in the crowd, so I went the opposite direction." Sarah gestured around the cabin. "I heard about these old mining roads in the mountains, places where people used to live but don't anymore. I thought maybe I could find an abandoned cabin, somewhere to hide until the baby was born, then figure out what to do next." "But your car went off the road." "Not exactly," Sarah admitted. "I saw headlights behind me on the main highway. 2 cars, driving fast, no lights but their headlights. Vincent always travels with backup, and something about the way they were moving, double quotes." She shrugged. "Maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't take the chance. I turned onto your road to get out of sight." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You think they followed you up here?" "I don't know. I lost control of the car about a mile up your road. It slid off into the trees, and I couldn't get it started again. I was trying to figure out what to do when the storm hit. I walked until I collapsed, and then you found me." "When was this?" 4 days ago." Marcus did the math. If Vincent's people had been tracking Sarah and had seen her turn onto the mountain road, they might have tried to follow before the storm hit. But the blizzard would have made pursuit impossible. The road would have been impassable within hours of the snow starting to fall. "They couldn't have made it up here in the storm," he said. "If they were following you, they're stuck down at the bottom until the roads are clear." Sarah nodded, but Marcus could see the fear in her eyes. "Vincent is patient when he needs to be. He'll wait." The implications of Sarah's story were sinking in. She wasn't just a pregnant teenager who needed temporary shelter. She was a fugitive being hunted by dangerous people. People who had already demonstrated they were willing to buy and sell human beings. People who viewed Sarah and her unborn child as valuable property. Marcus found himself thinking about the defensive preparations he'd made over the years. The cabin was well stocked and defensible, but he'd never seriously considered having to protect it from human threats. His isolation had always been his best security. "What's your plan?" he asked. "After the baby is born, I mean." Sarah's hand moved to her belly again. "I don't have one. I just knew I had to get away from Vincent, had to keep my baby safe. Everything else ... She shrugged helplessly. "I'm 17. I have no money, no ID except what's in Vincent's name. Now no family except a mother who sold me. I don't even know how to change a diaper." The hopelessness in her voice was heartbreaking. Marcus had seen that look before, the expression of someone who'd run as far as they could and realized there was nowhere left to go. "You said Vincent had connections in law enforcement," Marcus said. "How extensive?" "Rita said he had at least 3 cops on his payroll in Billings, plus a county sheriff's deputy, and a social worker who steers runaway girls his way instead of to legitimate shelters. I don't know how far his reach extends, but ... double quote serum met his eyes. "I can't trust anyone in an official capacity. Not anymore." Marcus understood. Sarah's world had been turned upside down to the point where the people who should have been her protectors had become her enemies. Police, social workers, even her own mother, all of them had either actively participated in her exploitation or failed to prevent it. "The baby," Marcus said. "Do you know when it's actually due?" Sarah shook her head. "I never saw a real doctor. Vincent had this woman who checked on the girls sometimes, but she wasn't. I don't think she was actually a doctor. More like someone who knew just enough to keep us alive and healthy for the customers." The casual way Sarah described such horror made Marcus's chest tight. She'd been living in hell for so long that it had become normal to her. "Based on when ... double quote Sarah's voice faltered. "Based on when Derek ... it should be soon. Maybe a few weeks. Maybe less, it's hard to tell." Marcus looked at her more carefully. Sarah was small-framed to begin with, but her belly seemed disproportionately large. And she'd been having what looked like discomfort that she'd been trying to hide. "Have you been having contractions?" he asked. Sarah bit her lip. "Sometimes, little ones." The woman at Vincent said that was normal toward the end. Marcus felt a new kind of worry settling in. If Sarah went into labor while they were still snowed in, he'd be responsible for delivering the baby with no medical training and no way to get help if something went wrong. The nearest hospital was 60 miles away, and that was assuming the roads were clear. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I need you to tell me immediately if the contractions get stronger or more regular. Do you understand?" She nodded, and Marcus could see that she understood the implications as well as he did. Outside, the wind was finally dying down, and the snow had decreased to occasional flurries. The storm was ending, which meant soon the roads would be clear. Soon, decisions would have to be made about what came next, but for now, they were still safely isolated, still protected by the miles of forest and snow that surrounded the cabin. And Marcus found himself hoping the isolation would last just a little longer, at least until he could figure out how to keep Sarah and her unborn child safe from the monsters who were hunting them. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. And in that warm circle of light, a young woman who'd survived horrors that would have broken many adults continued to fight for her life and the life of her child, while a man who'd spent 12 years running from his own past began to remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting. The morning after Sarah's revelation brought an eerie silence to the mountain. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a crystalline world where every branch was outlined in white and the air was so still that their breathing seemed to echo. Marcus stood on his porch at dawn, scanning the forest for any sign of movement, any disturbance in the pristine snow that might indicate unwelcome visitors. Everything appeared normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their sanctuary had become a trap. If Vincent's men had indeed followed Sarah up the mountain road, they would be waiting somewhere down below, patient as predators watching a den inside the cabin. Sarah was experiencing what she insisted were just more of the normal contractions she'd been having. But Marcus had noticed they were coming more frequently now, and Sarah's attempts to hide her discomfort were becoming less successful. Every few hours she would stop whatever she was doing and grip the nearest surface, her face going pale as she breathed through the pain. "These aren't just practice contractions," Marcus said after watching her endure another episode. "How long have they been this strong?" Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead, despite the cabin's moderate temperature. "Since yesterday morning, maybe. But the woman at Vincent's said labor could take days for a first baby. This is probably just ... preparation." Marcus wasn't convinced. He'd helped deliver foals and calves during his younger years working ranches, and he recognized the signs of impending birth. Sarah's body was preparing whether she wanted to admit it or not. "We need to get ready," he said, "just in case." He spent the morning gathering supplies, clean sheets, towels, his basic first aid kit, and anything else that might be useful. Sarah watched him with growing anxiety. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked. "What if there are complications?" It was a question Marcus had been avoiding thinking about. His medical knowledge was limited to basic emergency care, and childbirth could turn dangerous quickly. Without access to a hospital or even a midwife, they would be entirely on their own. "We'll deal with whatever happens," he said, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "Women have been having babies without hospitals for thousands of years." Sarah nodded, but he could see the fear in her eyes. She was still a child herself, facing the prospect of giving birth alone in a mountain cabin with winter closing in. Around them, that afternoon, Marcus made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed over 12 years of isolation. He fired up his old ham radio, a piece of equipment he hadn't used since moving to the mountain. The antenna was still functional, and after some adjustments, he managed to raise Doc Peterson in Cedar Falls. Dr. Peterson had been practicing rural medicine for 40 years and had probably delivered half the babies born in the county during that time. If anyone could provide guidance over a radio connection, it would be him. "Marcus, is that really you?" Doc's voice crackled through the static. "Thought you disappeared completely up there." "I'm here, Doc. Listen, I need some medical advice. Hypothetically speaking, if someone had to deliver a baby without medical assistance, what would be the most important things to know?" There was a pause. "This wouldn't be hypothetical, would it, Marcus? You got someone up there who needs help?" Marcus glanced at Sarah, who was listening intently. "Just humor me, Doc." For the next 20 minutes, Dr. Peterson walked Marcus through the basics of emergency childbirth. How to recognize the stages of labor, what to do if the umbilical cord was wrapped around the baby's neck, how to handle bleeding, when to be worried versus when to let nature take its course. "Most births go fine," Doc concluded. "The human body knows what it's doing. But Marcus, if you really do have someone up there who's about to give birth, you need to find a way to get them down here. I can't help you over the radio if there are serious complications." "I understand, Doc. Thanks. Marcus, be careful up there. There's been some unusual activity down here in town. Strangers asking questions, flashing money around. City types. In expensive cars who don't belong in Cedar Falls. They're asking about anyone who might have come through recently, particularly a young woman traveling alone." Marcus felt his blood turn cold. When did this start? 3 days ago, right after the storm hit. They've been staying at the motel, waiting for the roads to clear. But Marcus... These aren't the kind of people you want to meet alone in the woods. Thanks for the warning, Doc. Whatever you're mixed up in, son, just remember that pride isn't worth dying for. Sometimes the smart thing is to call for backup. The radio went silent, leaving Marcus and Sarah staring at each other in the sudden quiet of the cabin. "There. Here," Sarah whispered. "Vincent found me." Marcus nodded grimly. The net was closing around them faster than he'd hoped. Vincent's people were in Cedar Falls, which meant they had confirmed Sarah's general location. Once the mountain roads were passable, they would start searching systematically. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. Marcus considered the road conditions. The main highway would be clear by tomorrow, but the smaller mountain roads would take longer. The old logging road to his property would be the last priority for the county plows, if they plowed it at all. "Maybe 2 days before they can drive up here," he said. "But they might try to come on foot or with snowmobiles if they're motivated enough." Sarah doubled over as another contraction hit, this one strong enough to make her cry out. When it passed, she looked up at Marcus with desperation in her eyes. "I can't run anymore," she said. "Even if I wasn't about to give birth, I don't have anywhere to go. And if they find me... She touched her belly protectively. "They'll take my baby. They'll sell my child to strangers and force me into that life." Marcus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, but this time he didn't try to suppress it. For 12 years, he'd run from confrontation, chosen isolation over involvement. But looking at Sarah young, pregnant, terrified, with nowhere left to run, he realized his running days were over. "They're not taking you anywhere," he said quietly. And they're not getting your baby. Something in his voice made Sarah look at him more closely. What are you saying? I'm saying we should stop running. This is where we make our stand. Marcus moved to the gun cabinet he'd built into the cabin's back wall. Inside were weapons he'd hoped never to use against human targets, a hunting rifle, a shotgun, and a .45 caliber pistol he'd carried during his previous life. He began checking each weapon methodically, muscle memory from his old training taking over. You're going to fight them? Sarah's voice was small and uncertain. If that's what it takes. But there could be several of them. And they'll have guns too. Marcus looked up from cleaning his rifle. Sarah, what did I do before I came to this mountain? She shook her head. You never said. I was a police officer. 15 years with the Denver PD, the last 5 in SWAT. I know how men like Vincent operate, and I know how to stop them. The revelation hung in the air between them. Sarah studied his face with new understanding, seeing something in his demeanor that explained this calm competence, the way he'd handled her medical emergency, his ability to make quick decisions under pressure. What happened? She asked. Why did you leave? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands never stopping their methodical work on the weapons. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. I had a partner, Jake Morrison. We'd worked together for 8 years, trusted each other with our lives more times than I could count. Then we started investigating a human trafficking ring out of Denver. Girls disappearing from shelters, runaways being sold to the highest bidders. Sound familiar? Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. We got close to breaking the ring wide open. Had names, locations, financial records. Then one night, Jake called me to meet him at a warehouse. Said he had new evidence that would wrap up the whole case. Marcus's jaw tightened. It was a setup. Jake had been taking money from the traffickers, feeding them information about our investigation. When I walked into that warehouse, there were 3 men waiting to kill me. What happened? The revelation hung in the air between them. Sarah studied his face with new understanding, seeing something in his demeanor that explained the calm competence, the way he'd handled her medical emergency, his ability to make quick decisions under pressure. What happened? She asked. Why? Did you leave? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands never stopping their methodical work on the weapons. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. I had a partner, Jake Morrison. We'd worked together for 8 years, trusted each other with our lives more times than I could count. Then we started investigating a human trafficking ring operating out of Denver. Girls disappearing from shelters, runaways being sold to the highest bidders. Sound familiar? Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. We got close to breaking the ring wide open. Had names, locations, financial records. Then one night, Jake called me to meet him at a warehouse. Said he had new evidence that would wrap up the whole case. Marcus's jaw tightened. It was a setup. Jake had been taking money from the traffickers, feeding them information about our investigation. When I walked into that warehouse, there were 3 men waiting to kill me. What happened? I survived, they didn't, but Jake ... Marcus's voice trailed off. I found out he'd been dirty for years. Taking bribes, selling information, looking the other way while children were being bought and sold. Everything we'd worked for, every case we'd closed together, was tainted. Sarah was quiet, waiting for him to continue. The department covered it up. Couldn't have it getting out that a decorated SWAT officer was working for human traffickers. They forced Jake's early retirement, buried the evidence, and transferred me to a desk job where I couldn't cause problems. When I objected, when I tried to pursue the investigation on my own, they made it clear that my career was over. So you came here. I quit the force, sold everything I owned, and bought this land with what was left. I told myself I was done. Trying to save people who didn't want to be saved. Done fighting a system that protected the wrong people. Marcus met her eyes. But I was wrong. I wasn't done. I was just waiting for the right fight. Another contraction hit Sarah, stronger than the previous ones. She gripped the edge of the table, breathing hard until it passed. When she looked up, there was determination in her eyes alongside the fear. What do we do? She asked. Marcus had been formulating a plan since Doc Peterson's warning. The cabin was defensible, but not impregnable. If Vincent's men came in force, a direct assault would be difficult to repel. But Marcus had advantages they didn't know about: knowledge of the terrain, preparation time, and the element of surprise. First, we make sure you and the baby are safe, he said. There's a root cellar under the cabin with a hidden entrance. It's insulated, well ventilated, and stocked with supplies. If things go bad, that's where you'll be. What about you? I'll be making sure things don't go bad. Marcus spent the rest of the day preparing defensive positions around the cabin. He cleared fields of fire from the windows, set up barriers that would force attackers to approach from predictable angles, and established fallback positions if he needed to retreat. The work felt familiar in a way that was both comforting and disturbing. He'd spent 15 years training for exactly this kind of scenario, and the skills came back as if no time had passed at all. As evening approached, Sarah's contractions were coming every 20 minutes, regular enough that Marcus knew they were running out of time on multiple fronts. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not, and Vincent's people would be able to reach them soon. How are you feeling? He asked as Sarah rested between contractions. Scared, she admitted. About the birth, about Vincent, about everything. But also ... double quotes, she paused, searching for words. Also grateful. For the first time in my life, I feel like someone is actually protecting me instead of using me. Her words hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. For 12 years, he'd convinced himself that isolation was strength, that caring about people only led to betrayal and pain. But sitting in his cabin with Sarah, preparing to defend her and her unborn child against monsters who would destroy them both, he realized that some things were worth the risk. Sarah, he said carefully, after this is over, after the baby comes, and we deal with Vincent, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? She was quiet for a long time, one hand resting on her belly. I don't know. I've never really thought about what I wanted, only about surviving whatever was happening to me. But she looked around the cabin, at the warm firelight and the solid walls that had become a sanctuary. I've never felt safe anywhere before. Not really safe. Here, with you, even with everything that's happening, I feel like maybe it's possible. Marcus understood what she was saying without her having to spell it out. Sarah had never had a real home, never had someone who protected her without expecting something in return. The cabin represented something she'd never experienced before: genuine security. Then maybe you don't have to go anywhere, Marcus said quietly. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You would let us stay? Even after everything I've brought to your door? Sarah, you didn't bring trouble to my door. You brought purpose. For 12 years, I've been hiding up here, telling myself I was done fighting for what was right. But you reminded me who I used to be, who I still am underneath all the isolation and bitterness. Before Sarah could respond, another contraction hit, this one so strong it doubled her over. When it passed, she was breathing hard, and there was a new urgency in her expression. Marcus, she said, I think this is it. I think the baby is coming tonight. Outside, darkness was falling over the mountain, and somewhere down below, dangerous men were preparing to climb toward them. The timing couldn't have been worse, but timing had never been something Marcus could control. Then we'd better get ready, he said, helping Sarah to the makeshift birthing area he'd prepared near the fireplace. Because one way or another, by morning everything is going to be different. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light and dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, The mountain waited in silence, holding its breath for the confrontation that was coming. And inside, a young woman prepared to bring new life into a world that had shown her mostly darkness, while a man who had forgotten how to hope began to remember what it felt like to have something worth fighting for. The night stretched ahead of them, full of unknowns and possibilities. But for the first time in 12 years, Marcus Blackwood was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Protecting someone who needed protection, standing against evil, and maybe, just maybe, finding redemption in the process. Sarah's labor began in earnest just after midnight, her contractions now coming in waves that left her gasping and clutching at Marcus's hand. Between the pain, she managed to tell him this felt different from the earlier discomfort, deeper, more urgent, as if her body had made the final decision to bring this child into the world, regardless of the circumstances. Marcus had moved all his defensive equipment into position hours earlier. His rifle rested against the windowsill facing the main approach to the cabin. The shotgun was propped near the back door, and his sidearm remained holstered at his hip. Motion sensors he'd rigged along the tree line would give him advance warning of anyone approaching, their soft beeping transmitted to a receiver on his belt. How long? Sarah panted between contractions, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. Could be hours yet, Marcus said, though privately he suspected it would be sooner. Sarah's labor was progressing faster than typical for a first birth, perhaps because of the stress and adrenaline flooding her system. Try to breathe through each contraction. Don't fight against them. Sarah nodded, gripping his hand as another wave of pain crested. When it passed, she looked up at him with exhausted but determined eyes. Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know you saved us, both of us. Not just from the cold or from Vincent, but from a life where we never would have mattered to anyone. Before Marcus could respond, his motion sensor alarm chirped softly. He immediately moved to the window, peering out into the darkness through night vision binoculars he'd retrieved from his old equipment cache. At first, he saw nothing but snow-covered trees and shadows. Then movement caught his eye. Two figures, working their way up the logging road, moving with the practiced stealth of professionals. They're here, he said quietly, turning back to Sarah. Two men, maybe a quarter-mile out. They're being cautious, checking for traps or surveillance. Sarah's face went pale. How long before they reach the cabin? 20 minutes, maybe 30. If they continue being careful. Marcus moved to his rifle, checking the chamber and adjusting the scope. Sarah, I need you to get to the root cellar now. Take the emergency supplies and the baby kit I prepared. What if the baby comes while I'm down there? Then you do what women have done for millennia, you handle it. The instructions are in the kit, and you're stronger than you know. Marcus helped her to her feet as another contraction began building. If you hear gunshots, you stay hidden no matter what. Don't come out until I come for you personally. Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Marcus, promise me something. If it comes down to choosing between stopping them and saving yourself, you choose yourself. I won't have your death on my conscience. Marcus looked into her eyes, seeing the girl who had survived horrors that would have broken most people, who was about to give birth in a root cellar while armed men hunted her. I promise you this, your baby will be born free, and you'll both live to see tomorrow. Everything else is negotiable. He helped her down into the concealed root cellar, a space he'd excavated and reinforced years earlier for food storage, but which now served as a bunker. The entrance was hidden beneath a section of floorboard that looked identical to the rest, nearly invisible even when someone knew where to look. Remember, Marcus said as he prepared to close the hatch, no lights, no sounds. I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more when it's safe. Sarah nodded, already breathing through another contraction. Marcus closed the hatch and arranged the concealing floorboard, then scattered a few personal items across the area to make it look naturally lived in. His motion sensors chirped again. The intruders were closer now, maybe 10 minutes out. Marcus moved through the cabin methodically, checking his firing positions and reviewing his defensive plan. He'd spent 15 years training for situations exactly like this, and the muscle memory was returning with startling clarity. The key was to make them come to him on his terms. The cabin's position gave him good fields of fire in multiple directions. But more importantly, it forced attackers to approach uphill through terrain he knew intimately. Every tree, every depression in the snow, every angle of approach had been cataloged in his mind during 12 years of living here. Marcus settled into position at the front window, rifle ready, and waited. Patience was as much a weapon as ammunition. In a situation like this, the attackers would be cold, tired from the climb, and operating in unfamiliar territory. Every minute they spent exposed to the elements was a minute that worked in his favor. The first figure appeared at the edge of the tree line exactly where Marcus had expected, the most obvious approach route that offered the best cover. The man was dressed in dark winter gear and moved with professional competence, but he made the mistake of pausing too long in the same position. Through his scope, Marcus could see a hard face with the kind of scars that spoke of a violent profession. The second man emerged 30 yards to the left, attempting a flanking maneuver that would have been effective against an amateur. But Marcus had anticipated the move and had prepared countermeasures. Both men were now exposed in a killing field with limited cover and no easy retreat. Marcus keyed the handheld radio he'd left tuned to an emergency frequency. "This is Marcus Blackwood at the old Peterson logging site. I have armed intruders on my property. If anyone is monitoring this frequency, I may need assistance." It was a long shot. The nearest sheriff station was 60 miles away, and response time would be measured in hours rather than minutes. But if he didn't survive the night, at least there would be a record of what had happened. The lead intruder was close enough, now that Marcus could hear his boots crunching in the snow. The man was moving toward the cabin's front door with the confidence of someone who expected to find only an easy target inside. His partner had worked around to cover the back exit, completing what they thought was a foolproof tactical approach. Marcus waited until both men were committed to their positions, then made his move. He triggered a noisemaker he'd rigged in the trees behind the cabin, a simple device that would sound like someone moving through the underbrush. Both intruders immediately shifted their attention toward the false sound, presenting Marcus with clear shots at their exposed flanks. He didn't waste the opportunity. His first shot took the lead man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the snow. The report of the rifle echoed across the mountain like thunder, followed immediately by the wounded man's cry of pain and surprise. The second intruder reacted with professional speed, diving for cover behind the fallen, logged and returning fire with an automatic weapon that chewed chunks of wood from the cabin's walls. Marcus had already moved from his firing position, flowing to a secondary location as bullets shattered the window where he'd been standing moments earlier. "Federal agents." The unwounded man shouted, "Come out with your hands visible." Marcus almost laughed at the obvious lie. Real federal agents would have announced themselves before opening fire, would have followed protocol, would have brought backup and proper equipment. These were Vincent's men, probably ex-military contractors who hired themselves out to the highest bidder. "Wrong answer." Marcus called back, "But thanks for confirming you're not cops." He used the brief lull in gunfire to check on the wounded man, who was crawling toward better cover while leaving a trail of blood in the snow. The shoulder wound wouldn't be fatal, but it would significantly reduce the man's effectiveness in a firefight. Marcus's combat experience told him to press his advantage while he still held the initiative. He moved to a position that gave him an angle on the second intruder's cover, then systematically began destroying the man's concealment with precisely placed shots. Each bullet forced the man to shift position, keeping him off balance and preventing him from establishing effective return fire. "Your partner needs medical attention," Marcus called out during a pause to reload. "This can end right now if you walk away." "Can't do that," came the reply. "We have a contract to fulfill. Vincent's money isn't worth dying for." "Maybe not, but our reputation is." The exchange told Marcus everything he needed to know. These weren't desperate criminals or local thugs, they were professionals who had staked their credibility on completing this job. They wouldn't retreat unless forced to, and they wouldn't negotiate unless convinced they were outmatched. A new sound reached Marcus's ears from beneath the cabin. Sarah's muffled cry of pain, barely audible through the floorboards, but unmistakably the sound of someone in active labor. The baby was coming whether the tactical situation was resolved or not. The realization added urgency to Marcus's calculations. He couldn't afford a prolonged siege or a waiting game. Every minute that passed increased the chances that Sarah would need immediate medical assistance that he couldn't provide while under fire. Marcus made a decision that went against everything he'd been taught about defensive tactics. Instead of maintaining his protected position and forcing the attackers to come to him, he decided to take the fight to them. He slipped out the cabin side door and began working his way through the trees, using the terrain knowledge that 12 years of living here had given him. The snow would make his movement visible, but it would also muffle sound and limit the intruder's ability to track him effectively. The wounded man was easier to locate. His labored breathing and occasional groans of pain made him a clear target. Marcus found him propped against a boulder, trying to bandage his shoulder wound with increasingly clumsy fingers. Hypothermia was setting in, making the man's movements sluggish and uncoordinated. "Drop your weapon," Marcus said, emerging from the trees with his rifle trained on the wounded intruder. The man looked up with eyes that were already glazing over from shock and cold. "Go to hell." "You first," Marcus replied, but instead of shooting, he kicked the man's weapon away and began applying proper first aid to the shoulder wound. "What's your name? Why?" "Because I'm trying to decide whether to let you freeze to death or drag you somewhere warm." The man studied Marcus's face, perhaps seeing something there that convinced him this wasn't an idle threat. "Collins, Ray Collins." "Well, Ray, here's your situation. Your partner is pinned down and outnumbered. You're going into shock from blood loss and exposure. Your boss Vincent sent you up here to collect a pregnant teenager, but what you found instead was someone who's killed more people than you have fingers. This isn't going to end the way you planned." Collins was quiet for a moment, processing the information. "You're offering a deal?" "I'm offering you a chance to live through this. Walk away now, and I'll even let you take one of my snowmobiles to get down the mountain before you freeze. Stay, and I guarantee you won't see the sunrise." "What about the girl? What about her?" "Vincent's paying good money for her return." Marcus leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Ray, let me explain something to you. That girl is under my protection now. Anyone who tries to harm her will have to go through me first. And I promise you, that's not a trip you want to take." Collins studied Marcus's face and apparently saw something there that convinced him. "My partner won't give up. Tony's a stubborn bastard. Then Tony's problem isn't with me anymore. It's with the mountain, the cold, and the fact that he's operating in terrain where I have every possible advantage." Marcus stood up, shouldering his rifle. "You've got 5 minutes to convince your partner to leave before I start treating this like a war zone instead of a police action." From beneath the cabin came another muffled cry, longer and more urgent than before. Sarah's labor was progressing rapidly, and Marcus was running out of time for negotiations. He left Collins bandaged but disarmed, and began working his way toward the second intruder's position. Tony had maintained good fire discipline and tactical awareness, but he was fighting a losing battle against exposure and an enemy who knew every inch of the terrain. Marcus found him exactly where tactical doctrine would suggest in a position that provided good cover and multiple escape routes, but which also isolated him from his wounded partner. Tony was a professional, but he was following textbook tactics in a situation that demanded improvisation. "Tony," Marcus called from a position of concealment. "Your partner's wounded and hypothermic. This is your chance to collect him and leave with your lives." "Not happening," came the immediate reply. "We finish what we started." Marcus sighed. Some people had to learn the hard way. What followed was a brief but decisive engagement that showcased the difference between textbook tactics and real-world experience. Tony fought competently and bravely, but he was operating at a severe disadvantage against an opponent who controlled the terrain and had superior motivation. When the gunfire finally stopped, Tony was unconscious from a concussion sustained when Marcus had brought a tree branch down on his head, and Collins was barely conscious from blood loss and cold. Both men were alive but thoroughly defeated. Marcus quickly zip-tied both intruders and dragged them to his equipment shed, where they would be protected from the elements, but unable to cause further trouble. He would deal with them properly after making sure Sarah and the baby were safe. As he approached the cabin, he could hear Sarah's cries of pain even through the floorboards and insulation of the root cellar. The baby was coming now, and there was no more time for tactical considerations. Marcus knocked on the concealed hatch in the pattern. He'd established 3 knocks, paused, then 2 more. A moment later, Sarah's strained voice called out, "Marcus, is it over?" "It's over," he confirmed, lifting the hatch to find Sarah lying on the emergency mattress he'd placed in the cellar, her face flushed with exertion and pain. "How are you doing?" "The baby's coming now," she gasped. "I can feel. I think I can see the head." Marcus climbed down into the cellar, his hands already moving to the birthing supplies he'd prepared. Outside, snow continued to fall on a mountain that had just witnessed violence but was now returning to peace. And in the cramped space beneath his cabin, a new life was about to enter the world under circumstances that would become part of family legend for generations to come. The confrontation was over, but the real challenge was just beginning. First cry pierced the silence of the root cellar at 3:47 a.m., a sound so pure and immediate that it seemed to wash away all the violence and terror of the previous hours. Marcus looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face of Sarah's daughter. It was definitely a girl, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. After 12 years of isolation, after a lifetime of seeing humanity at its worst, here was proof that something good could still emerge from darkness. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her exhausted face as Marcus carefully placed the baby on her chest. "She's really here. She's really mine." The birth had been surprisingly smooth despite the circumstances. Sarah's body had seemed to know exactly what to do, and the baby had emerged healthy and angry at the world. She'd just entered. Marcus's hands, steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system, had guided the process with a competence that surprised even him. "What will you name her?" Marcus asked as he cleaned up the birthing area, his movements automatic and efficient. Sarah studied her daughter's face, one finger tracing the baby's tiny features. "Grace," she said finally. "Her name is Grace, because that's what she is, Grace. I never deserved, but somehow received anyway." Grace Michelle, as if sensing the weight of her name, opened her eyes and gazed up at her mother with the unfocused but intense stare that newborns possess. Sarah laughed through her tears, a sound of pure joy that seemed impossible given everything she'd endured. "Hello, my beautiful girl," Sarah murmured. "Welcome to the world. I know it's scary and complicated, but I promise you something. You will never doubt that you're loved. You will never wonder if you matter. And you will never, ever be sold or traded or treated like property." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he listened. This young woman, who had been betrayed by every adult who should have protected her, was already making vows to break the cycle of abuse and abandonment that had defined her own life. After ensuring both mother and baby were stable, Marcus climbed out of the root cellar to deal with the two men he'd secured in his equipment shed. Ray Collins was conscious but weak from blood loss, while Tony remained unconscious from his head injury. Both would need medical attention soon, but Marcus's first priority was making sure they posed no further threat. He checked their bonds and searched them thoroughly, finding identification that confirmed they were indeed professional contractors. Collins carried a military ID from his previous service, while Tony's wallet contained business cards for a private security firm based in Las Vegas. Both men had been well paid for this job, judging by the expensive equipment and quality of their winter gear. Marcus also found something that made his blood run cold: a detailed dossier on Sarah, complete with photographs, personal information, and what appeared to be a bidding sheet for the baby. Vincent hadn't just been planning to retrieve his property, he'd been taking advance orders for the child from prospective buyers. The documents also revealed the scope of Vincent's operation: names, locations, financial records, and a client list that included politicians, business executives, and entertainment industry figures. Sarah's case was just one of dozens, and Vincent's network stretched across multiple states. Marcus photographed every document with his phone before returning to the cabin. This information could bring down Vincent's entire operation. But first he needed to ensure Sarah and Grace were permanently safe from retaliation. Dawn was breaking over the mountain as Marcus returned to the root cellar. Sarah had managed to get Grace to nurse and was holding her daughter with the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear. The transformation in Sarah was remarkable. Just hours earlier she'd been a frightened teenager, but motherhood had awakened something powerful and determined in her. "How are my prisoners?" Sarah asked with a slight smile. "Alive and secured. They'll need medical attention, but they're not going anywhere." Marcus sat down beside her, studying Grace's sleeping face. "Sarah, I found something in their belongings that you need to see." He showed her the photographs of the documents, watching her face pale as she realized the full extent of what Vincent had planned for her child. "He already had buyers," she whispered. "Before Grace was even born, he was selling her." Marcus nodded grimly. "This goes deeper than just Vincent's local operation. These documents show connections to trafficking networks across the country. If we turn this over to the right people, we could save a lot of children." Sarah's grip tightened on Grace. "What do you mean, the right people?" "You said Vincent has law enforcement connections." "He has local connections, but this evidence shows federal crimes crossing state lines. That puts it in FBI jurisdiction, and Vincent's local contacts won't be able to protect him from a federal investigation." Marcus paused. "But Sarah, if we do this, it means exposing what happened to you. You'd have to testify, relive everything." In court, Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her sleeping daughter. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and resolved. "How many other girls are out there right now, going through what I went through? How many other babies are being sold to the highest bidder? According to these documents, dozens, maybe hundreds. Then we do it. We turn over everything to the FBI, and I'll testify to whatever they need. Grace deserves to grow up in a world where fewer children are treated like commodities." Marcus felt a surge of pride and admiration for Sarah's courage. At 18, having just given birth under extraordinary circumstances, she was choosing to put herself at risk to protect other children she'd never met. "There's something else," Marcus said. "These documents prove that your mother was more than just a desperate addict making a bad decision. She was a recruiter for Vincent's operation. The money she received for you wasn't a one-time payment. It was a commission on what was supposed to be an ongoing business relationship." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: hurt, anger, and finally a kind of grim acceptance. So she would have done it again, found other girls for Vincent. The documents suggest she already had. Your situation wasn't unique. Sarah, your mother had been feeding vulnerable teenagers to Vincent's operation for at least 2 years. The revelation hung between them in the cramped space of the root cellar. Sarah processed this final betrayal, the knowledge that her mother hadn't just sold her in desperation, but had made a career of destroying young lives. Then stopping Vincent protects her future victims too, Sarah said finally, including any other children my mother might have recruited. Marcus helped Sarah and Grace move back into the main cabin as the sun climbed higher in the mountain sky. The space felt different, now no longer a hermit's solitary refuge but a family home. Sarah settled into the rocking chair by the fireplace, Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Marcus made breakfast and planned their next steps. The immediate priority was dealing with Collins and Tony. Both men needed medical attention that Marcus couldn't provide, but simply calling for emergency services would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer until he'd secured federal protection. For Sarah and Grace, Marcus activated his ham radio and reached out to Doc Peterson in Cedar Falls. "Doc, it's Marcus again. I have 2 men here who need medical attention, gunshot wound and head injury. But I need to arrange federal protection before I can bring them down." "Marcus, what the hell is going on up there?" Doc's voice crackled through the static. "There were federal agents in town yesterday asking about you specifically." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. What kind of federal agents? FBI. Showed proper credentials, asked proper questions. They seemed legitimate, but they were very interested in any contact you might have had with a young woman named Sarah Mitchell. Marcus looked at Sarah, who had heard every word. She nodded, understanding that this was the moment of truth. Either the FBI was already investigating Vincent's operation, or Vincent's corruption reached higher than they'd suspected. "Doc, I'm going to give you a frequency to monitor. If you don't hear from me in the next 6 hours, contact the FBI field office in Billings and tell them Marcus Blackwood has evidence related to Vincent Carrera's trafficking operation." "Marcus, just do it, Doc, and thanks for everything." Marcus switched to an encrypted frequency he remembered from his police days and began transmitting a message that would either save them or doom them. "This is former Denver PD Detective Marcus Blackwood. I have custody of Sarah Mitchell and evidence related to Vincent Carrera's human trafficking operation. I also have 2 of Carrera's contractors who attempted to kidnap Mitchell from my location. Request immediate federal protection and medical assistance." The response came faster than Marcus had expected. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, FBI. We've been looking for Miss Mitchell for the past week. Is she safe?" "She's safe, and she just gave birth to a healthy baby girl. But I have 2 wounded men who need immediate medical attention, and I'm not moving Miss Mitchell until I have guarantees about her protection." "Understood. We have a helicopter standing by and can be at your location within 30 minutes. Can you provide coordinates?" Marcus gave them his precise GPS coordinates, then sat back to wait. Sarah was listening to every word, Grace still sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Do you trust them?" Sarah asked. "I trust the evidence we have," Marcus replied. "If they're legitimate FBI, the documents we found will be invaluable to their investigation. If they're not legitimate, we're probably dead either way." "That's comforting," Sarah said with dark humor. 20-8 minutes later, the sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the mountain valley. Marcus watched through his binoculars as a medical helicopter touched down in the clearing he'd designated, followed immediately by a second aircraft carrying what appeared to be a full FBI tactical team. Special Agent Walsh was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as she surveyed Marcus's defensive preparations around the cabin. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, but her demeanor suggested law enforcement rather than military contractor. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for making contact. We've been investigating Carrera's operation for 8 months, but we've had difficulty finding witnesses willing to testify. Marcus shook her hand, noting the calluses. That suggested she still spent time on the shooting range. Miss Mitchell has agreed to cooperate fully, but she has conditions, which are complete federal protection for her and her daughter, new identities if necessary, and guaranteed prosecution of everyone involved in the trafficking operation, including the law enforcement officials on Carrera's payroll. Agent Walsh nodded. We can arrange all of that. The documents you mentioned, do you have them? Marcus handed over the photographs he'd taken, watching Walsh's expression change as she reviewed them. Her professional composure slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger underneath. This is incredible, she said. These documents contain evidence we've been trying to gather for months. Financial records, client lists, operational details. This could bring down the entire network. What about Vincent? Sarah asked from the doorway, Grace still in her arms. Agent Walsh turned to study Sarah, and Marcus could see the federal agent taking in the young woman's obvious youth, her exhausted but determined expression, and the newborn baby she held protectively. Vincent Carrera was arrested 6 hours ago, Walsh said gently. We've been building a case against him for months, but we needed witnesses. When you disappeared from his operation, we knew we had a narrow window to act before he could destroy evidence and eliminate potential witnesses. Sarah's legs gave out, and Marcus caught her before she could fall. The relief was overwhelming. For weeks she'd been running from a monster who had seemed all-powerful, and now that monster was in federal custody. Your mother was arrested at the same time, Walsh continued. She's agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sarah's expression hardened. What kind of reduced sentence? That will depend on the extent of her cooperation and the number of victims she helped Carrera find. But Sarah, she's provided information that has already led to the rescue of 7 other girls. Marcus felt Sarah trembling in his arms, processing the complex emotions of learning that her mother's betrayal had been even more extensive than she'd imagined, but that her arrest might save other children from the same fate. The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. Paramedics stabilized Collins and Tony before airlifting them to the hospital in Billings, where they would be treated under federal guard. FBI evidence technicians photographed and cataloged everything Marcus had taken from the contractors, while other agents began the process of documenting Sarah's story. Agent Walsh proved to be both professional and compassionate as she interviewed Sarah, taking care to minimize the trauma of reliving her experiences while gathering the detailed testimony that would be crucial for prosecution. She was particularly gentle when discussing the circumstances of Grace's conception, understanding that this part of Sarah's story would be the most difficult to revisit in court. The good news, Walsh said after completing the initial interview, is that we have enough evidence from the documents you provided to prosecute the major players without requiring you to testify about the sexual assault. Your testimony about the trafficking and forced pregnancy will be sufficient. Sarah visibly relaxed at this news. So I won't have to discuss Derek in court. Not unless you choose to. We have medical evidence and corroborating testimony from other victims that establishes the pattern of sexual abuse in Carrera's operation. As the day progressed, it became clear that Sarah and Grace were at the center of a much larger operation to dismantle Vincent's trafficking network. The FBI had been building cases against similar operations across the country, and Sarah's evidence provided crucial links that would allow them to pursue federal racketeering charges. What happens next? Marcus asked as the FBI team prepared to leave. Miss Mitchell and her daughter will be relocated to a safe house while we prepare for trial, Walsh said. Given the scope of the operation and the number of potential co-conspirators, we expect the legal proceedings to take at least a year. Sarah looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, then at Marcus, who had risked everything to protect her. What about Marcus? Will he be safe here? Walsh followed Sarah's gaze. To Marcus, Mr. Blackwood's law enforcement background and his role in capturing Carrera's men actually make him a valuable asset to our investigation. We'd like him to consider consulting on our efforts to identify and apprehend other trafficking operations. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. For 12 years, he'd avoided any involvement with law enforcement, convinced that the system was too corrupt to serve justice. But Sarah's courage in choosing to testify, despite everything she'd suffered, reminded him of why he'd become a police officer in the first place. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "But my first priority is making sure Sarah and Grace are safe." Agent Walsh smiled. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, we were hoping you might consider serving as Miss Mitchell's protection detail during the transition period. You've already proven quite effective in that role." Sarah's face lit up with hope and relief. She'd been dreading the prospect of being separated from the man who had saved her life and delivered her child. The idea that Marcus might continue to be part of her and Grace's protection felt like another piece of grace she didn't deserve, but desperately needed. "Would you?" Sarah asked, looking at Marcus with eyes that held both hope and fear of disappointment. Over the past 3 years, Marcus had become an unofficial expert in investigating trafficking operations hidden in rural areas. His law enforcement background, combined with his intimate knowledge of how people could disappear into remote locations, had made him valuable to federal agencies tracking similar networks across the country. The work was sporadic, a few weeks here and there when his expertise was needed, but it provided purpose and supplemented their mountain lifestyle. "The Oregon case?" Sarah asked. "The one with the missing girls from the foster system?" "That's the one. They think there's a connection to the Nevada operation we helped shut down last year." Marcus paused. It would mean being away for about 2 weeks. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. In the early years, she had struggled with anxiety whenever Marcus had to leave for consultation work, terrified that something would happen to him or that she wouldn't be able to protect Grace alone. But time and therapy had helped her develop confidence in her own strength, and she now understood that Marcus's work was an extension of the same protective instinct that had saved her and Grace. "Grace and I will be fine," she said finally. "Besides, Mrs. Henderson said she'd love to have us stay with her if we get lonely." Mrs. Henderson was their nearest neighbor, a widow in her 70s who had become a surrogate grandmother to Grace and a source of practical mountain wisdom for Sarah. The community around Cedar Falls had embraced their unconventional family with the kind of acceptance that small towns sometimes offered to people who had proven themselves through adversity. "I'll think about it," Marcus said. "But right now, I'm exactly where I want to be." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over the peaks that had become their protective guardians. So much had changed since that desperate night when Sarah had collapsed in the snow, but the mountains remained constant witnesses to their transformation from broken individuals into a family forged by choice and strengthened by love. The next morning brought visitors, Agent Walsh and her new partner, Agent Rodriguez, making their quarterly check-in. These visits had evolved from security assessments into social calls, as the FBI agents had become invested in seeing how Sarah and Grace were thriving. "Grace has grown another 3 inches," Agent Walsh observed, watching the little girl demonstrate her tree-climbing skills with the fearless enthusiasm of a mountain child. "She's going to be tall like her mama," Marcus said with pride, "and probably just as stubborn." "I heard that," Sarah called from the kitchen, where she was preparing lunch for their guests. Agent Rodriguez, a younger woman who specialized in victim services, spent time talking with Sarah about her ongoing therapy and adjustment to normal life. These conversations had become less frequent over the years, as Sarah had processed her trauma and built a stable foundation for her future. "You've done remarkable work," Rodriguez told Sarah as they walked through the expanded garden. "The transformation In you over the past 5 years has been extraordinary to witness. I had good people helping me, Sarah replied. Marcus, Agent Walsh, Dr. Cameron at the trauma center. Even Mrs. Henderson teaching me how to vegetables and preserve meat for winter. It takes a village, as they say. And Grace? How is she adjusting to the idea of starting school? Sarah glanced toward the playground area Marcus had built, where Grace was showing Agent Walsh how to properly feed the chickens they'd added to their mountain homestead. She's excited and nervous in equal measure, Sarah said. We've been homeschooling her with online programs, but the social interaction will be good for her. And Cedar Falls Elementary has been wonderful about accommodating our situation. The decision to enroll Grace in public school had been difficult but necessary. The little girl was bright and curious, and she needed interaction with other children her age. The school principal, who had been briefed on their general circumstances without unnecessary details, had assured them that Grace's privacy would be protected and that any special security measures would be handled discreetly. That afternoon, after the agents had departed, Marcus found Sarah sitting by the creek that ran along the edge of their property. She was holding a letter that had arrived in the morning mail, and her expression was thoughtful rather than distressed. "What's that?" he asked, settling beside her on the bank. "An invitation," Sarah said, handing him the envelope. "From the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They want me to speak at their annual conference." Marcus read the letter carefully. It was a formal invitation for Sarah to address an audience of law enforcement professionals, social workers, and advocates about her experiences as a trafficking survivor and her insights into effective rescue and rehabilitation programs. "That's quite an honor," he said. "What are you thinking?" Sarah picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water, watching the ripples spread outward in perfect concentric circles. "I'm thinking that Grace is old enough now to understand, in age-appropriate terms, that her mama has an important job helping other children who are in trouble. And I'm thinking that maybe it's time to take our story public in a bigger way. Not the details that should stay private, but the broader message that survival is possible, that healing happens, that broken families can become whole in unexpected ways." Marcus understood the significance of what Sarah was considering. For 5 years, their focus had been on healing, building their life together, and maintaining their privacy while Sarah testified in legal proceedings. But Grace was growing up, their situation was stable, and Sarah had developed into a powerful advocate for other survivors. It would mean travel, public speaking, probably some media attention, Marcus said, making sure she understood the implications. "I know, and I know it might make our quiet mountain life a little less quiet." Sarah turned to look at him. "How do you feel about that?" Marcus considered the question seriously. The hermit who had valued solitude above all else might have been horrified at the prospect of public attention. But the man he had become, the father who tucked Grace into bed each night, the partner who supported Sarah's healing and growth, understood that some stories needed to be told. "I think," he said slowly, "that you have wisdom that could help a lot of people. And I think Grace should grow up seeing her mother use her voice to protect other children." Sarah smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. "So you're okay with Papa Marcus becoming a public figure as the man who saved us?" "Sarah, you saved yourself. You made the choice to run, to fight, to trust a stranger, to testify against dangerous people, to build a new life from nothing. I just provided a safe place for you to do the hard work." "We saved each other," Sarah corrected. "You saved me from freezing in the snow, and I saved you from freezing in isolation." That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the kitchen, that had become the heart of their home, Grace chattered about her plans for her upcoming 6th birthday party. She wanted to invite her few friends from town, plus Mrs. Henderson, Agent Walsh if she could make it, and all the forest animals, but Mama says they probably won't come to a party. "What kind of cake do you want, little bear?" Marcus asked. "Chocolate. With vanilla frosting," Grace said without hesitation. "And I want 6 candles plus 1 for good luck, just like Mama taught me." Sarah caught Marcus's eye across the kitchen, both of them thinking about how different Grace's life was from Sarah's own childhood. This little girl would grow up with birthday parties and bedtime stories, with adults who competed to spoil her with attention rather than neglect or abuse. She would know unconditional love, financial security, educational opportunities, and the confidence that came from being genuinely wanted and cherished. Later that night, after Grace had fallen asleep and they had finished the evening chores that mountain living required, Sarah and Marcus sat in their bedroom reviewing the materials from the conference invitation. The scope of the event was impressive: over 1,000 attendees, keynote speakers who were national experts in their fields, workshops on everything from prevention to prosecution to rehabilitation. "I want to do this," Sarah said finally. "Not just the conference, but everything it represents. I want to become the kind of advocate who helps change systems, who speaks for children who can't speak for themselves." Marcus nodded, unsurprised by her decision. Over the years, he had watched Sarah transform from victim to survivor, to something even more powerful, a voice for justice who combined lived experience with genuine compassion and hard-won wisdom. "Then we'll make it work," he said simply. "Whatever support you need, whatever changes we have to make to our life here, we'll figure it out together. Even if it means less privacy, more travel, people knowing our story." Marcus looked at Sarah holding her newborn daughter, at the federal agents who represented a chance to make a real difference in the fight against human trafficking, and at the cabin that had been his refuge, but could now become something more, a home for a family that had been born from tragedy but forged in courage. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll keep you safe. Both of you, for as long as you need me to." Sarah's tears were different this time, not tears of pain or fear, but tears of gratitude and hope. Grace stirred in her arms, opening her eyes to look up at the faces of the people who would shape her world. A mother who had fought for her freedom before she was even born, and a man who had learned that isolation wasn't strength, but that protecting those who needed protection was the highest calling he could answer. As the FBI helicopter lifted off from the mountain clearing, taking Collins and Tony away to face justice, Sarah stood on the porch of the cabin holding her daughter. Marcus stood beside her, no longer a hermit hiding from the world, but a protector ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The mountain stretched away below them, peaceful and eternal. But the silence was different, now not the silence of isolation, but the quiet that comes before a new chapter begins. They had survived the darkness and emerged into something neither of them had dared to hope for. A future where they were no longer alone, where Grace could grow up safe and loved, and where the cycle of abuse and abandonment that had defined Sarah's life would finally be broken. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be legal proceedings, therapy, the challenge of building a life from nothing. But they would face it together, bound not by blood or law, but by the choices they had made to protect each other when protection mattered most. And in the growing light of a new day, Grace Mitchell slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that she had been born into a story of redemption, courage, and the kind of love that transforms broken people into something stronger than they ever thought possible. 5 years had passed since that snowy night, when Grace first opened her eyes in a mountain root cellar, and the little girl now raced through the same forest paths where her mother had once collapsed in desperation. Her laughter echoed off the granite cliffs as she chased butterflies through wildflower meadows, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner of pure joy. "Mama!" "Papa Marcus, look what I found," Grace called out, holding up a perfectly formed pinnacone, as if it were the greatest treasure ever discovered. Sarah looked up from the vegetable garden she was tending, now expanded to 3 times its original size to feed their growing household. At 23, She had grown into the kind of woman who commanded respect without demanding it. Strong, confident, with eyes that had seen darkness but chose to focus on light. The scared teenager who had stumbled through the snow was gone, replaced by someone who had built a life worth living through sheer determination and the support of people who loved her. Marcus emerged from the workshop he'd built behind the cabin, wood shavings in his graying hair and a smile on his face that had become his default expression over the past few years. The solitary hermit who had once measured his days in silence had been replaced by a man who delighted in the sound of a child's voice calling him Papa, even though no blood connected them. "That's a Douglas fir cone, little bear," he said, kneeling down to examine Grace's treasure with the same serious attention he'd once reserved for tracking weather patterns. "See how the scales spiral up from the base? Each one of those held seeds that could grow into trees taller than our cabin." Grace studied the pinnacone with the intense focus that 5-year-olds brought to things that fascinated them. "Will you help me plant them, Papa? I want to make a forest for when I'm big like Mama." "We'll plant them together," Marcus promised, ruffling her hair. "But first, what do you say we help your Mama with dinner? I think I smell something good cooking." The cabin had evolved significantly over the years. What had once been a functional but Spartan shelter for one had been transformed into a warm family home. An addition on the east side provided a proper bedroom for Sarah and Grace, while Marcus had claimed the loft space he'd built above the main room. Solar panels now powered LED lighting throughout the house, and a satellite internet connection kept them linked to the outside world when necessary. But the most significant changes weren't architectural, they were atmospheric. The walls now displayed Grace's artwork alongside the practical tools of mountain living. Children's books shared shelf space with survival manuals. The sound of laughter and conversation had replaced the heavy silence that had once filled every corner. During dinner, a hearty stew made from vegetables they'd grown and venison Marcus had hunted Grace chattered about her day with the endless enthusiasm of a child who had never known fear or want. She talked about the baby deer she'd seen near the creek, the rainbow that had appeared after yesterday's brief thunderstorm, and her plans to build a treehouse in the giant oak that stood at the edge of their property. "Tell me the story," Grace demanded as Marcus tucked her into bed, a nightly ritual that had evolved over the years. "Which story?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "The story about how you and Mama found each other." Sarah joined them, settling into the rocking chair beside Grace's bed. Over the years, they had developed a version of their origin story that was appropriate for a young child, one that emphasized courage, kindness, and the way love could grow in unexpected places while carefully omitting the darker details that Grace wasn't old enough to understand. "Once upon a time," Sarah began, her voice taking on the storyteller's cadence that Grace loved, "there was a brave man who lived alone in the mountains because he thought he didn't need anyone else. He spent his days chopping wood and watching the seasons change, convinced that solitude was the same thing as peace. And then there was a young woman," Marcus continued, "who had lost her way in more ways than one. She was carrying something precious, a little girl who hadn't been born yet, and she was looking for somewhere safe to raise her daughter." Grace snuggled deeper into her blankets, already knowing every word but loving the familiar rhythm of the tale. "And then what happened?" "Then the winter came," Sarah said, "and the young woman found herself in trouble, cold and scared and not sure where to turn. But the brave man found her, and even though he thought he wanted to be alone, he couldn't leave someone who needed help. Because helping people is what brave people do." Grace recited the moral that had been woven through every version of the story. "Exactly," Marcus said. "And while they waited for spring to come, something magical happened. The man learned that taking care of people didn't make him weak, it made him stronger. And the young woman learned that there really were people in the world who would protect others without asking for anything in return. And when I was born, I made the family. Complete, Grace added with satisfaction. You made everything complete, Sarah agreed, kissing her daughter's forehead. You turned a cabin into a home, strangers into family, and fear into hope. After Grace fell asleep, Sarah and Marcus sat on the porch in the comfortable silence that had replaced the isolation of earlier years. The mountain night was alive with the sounds of forest creatures going about their nocturnal business, and the stars above seemed close enough to touch in the thin mountain air. Agent Walsh called today, Sarah said eventually. The last of Vincent's associates was sentenced. 25 years for trafficking and racketeering, Marcus nodded. The legal proceedings had stretched over 4 years, with Sarah testifying in multiple trials as Vincent's network was systematically dismantled. She had faced each court appearance with the same quiet courage she brought to everything else, understanding that her willingness to speak out was helping to free other children from similar fates. How do you feel about it being over? Marcus asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. Relieved mostly, but also proud, I guess. When I think about all the girls who are safe now because we spoke up, because we fought back instead of just running, it makes everything we went through feel worthwhile. The final tallies had been staggering. Vincent's operation had been trafficking over 100 young women and children across 6 states. The evidence Sarah and Marcus had provided had led to the arrest and conviction of 37 people, including the corrupt law enforcement officers who had been protecting the operation. Sarah's mother had ultimately received a 15-year sentence, reduced from life in prison in exchange for her cooperation with federal investigators. Any word from her? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. No, and I don't expect any, Sarah replied. Agent Walsh said she's been clean for 2 years now, doing well in the prison rehabilitation program. But I think we both understand that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Marcus understood. Sarah had made her peace with her mother's choices, but forgiveness didn't require maintaining a relationship with someone who had caused such profound harm. Grace would grow up knowing the truth about her grandmother when she was old enough, but she would also grow up surrounded by people who had chosen to love and protect her. I've been thinking about the consultation request from the Portland field office, Marcus said, changing the subject to lighter topics. Sarah, our story is one of the good ones. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things for each other. It's about love conquering abuse, about a chosen family being as strong as blood family, about how helping others helps heal ourselves. Marcus took her hand. If telling that story helps even one person find hope or courage, then it's worth whatever inconvenience comes with it. The next morning brought a surprise visitor, Dr. Susan Cameron, the trauma specialist who had worked with Sarah during the early years of her healing process. She arrived unannounced, as was her habit, carrying fresh bagels from the bakery in Cedar Falls and a grin that suggested she had good news to share. I heard through the grapevine that you're considering the NCMEC speaking invitation, she said. Over coffee on the porch. Word travels fast, Sarah laughed. I only decided last night. Small world in the victim advocacy community, Dr. Cameron replied. And I have a proposition for you. What if I told you there was a program being developed that could use someone with your exact combination of experience, education, and communication skills? Sarah leaned forward, intrigued. Over the past 2 years, she had been taking online college courses, working toward a degree in social work with a focus on trauma-informed care. The program was designed for working adults and allowed her to study while maintaining her responsibilities to Grace and their mountain household. What kind of program? A comprehensive training curriculum for law enforcement, social workers, and medical professionals who work with trafficking survivors. Real-world application of trauma-informed techniques, taught by people who've lived through the system and can speak to what works and what doesn't. Dr. Cameron explained the vision, a nationwide training program that would bring together survivors, law enforcement professionals, mental health experts, and legal advocates to create more effective and compassionate responses to human trafficking cases. The federal government is funding pilot programs in 5 regions, she continued. We need regional coordinators who can travel to different locations, train various professional groups, and help develop protocols that actually serve survivors instead of re-traumatizing them. Sarah felt excitement building in her chest. This was exactly the kind of work she had been hoping to do, meaningful, impactful, drawing on her own experiences to help others while building a career that could support her family. Where would the regional coordination be based? Marcus asked, immediately thinking through the practical implications. Wherever the coordinator chooses to live, Dr. Cameron said. The job involves travel, but the base of operations can be anywhere with good internet and reasonable airport access. Some people might choose urban centers, but honestly, I think there's value in having coordinators who understand rural and remote communities where trafficking often goes undetected. Sarah and Marcus exchanged a look that communicated volumes. Their mountain home could serve as the headquarters for work that spanned multiple states, allowing them to maintain the life they'd built while expanding Sarah's impact exponentially. When would this start? Sarah asked. The funding is approved starting next fiscal year. Training for the coordinators would begin this fall, with the first pilot programs launching after the new year. Dr. Cameron leaned back in her chair. Sarah, I know this is a big decision, and I know you have Grace to consider. But I also know that you have a gift for this work, and there are thousands of children who could benefit from the kind of programs you could help develop. That afternoon, while Grace napped and Marcus worked on expanding their chicken coop, Sarah hiked up to the meadow where she often went to think through important decisions. The view from that spot encompassed their entire valley, the cabin that had become their sanctuary, the creek that provided their water, the forest paths where Grace played safely every day. 5 years ago, she had been a terrified teenager with no hope and no options. Now she was being offered the chance to become a national leader in the fight against the very system that had nearly destroyed her. The irony wasn't lost on her, but neither was the opportunity. When she returned to the cabin, she found Marcus helping Grace build a miniature log cabin for her dolls, using techniques he'd learned during his own construction projects. The scene epitomized everything their life had become: practical skills, passed down with love, imagination encouraged and supported, a sense of safety and permanence that allowed dreams to flourish. I want to do it, she announced without preamble. Marcus looked up from the tiny logs he was helping Grace notch. The training program? All of it. The conference speaking, the regional coordinator position, the travel, the advocacy work, everything. Sarah sat down cross-legged beside them. But only if we can do it as a family. Only if it enhances our life instead of disrupting it. Grace looked up from her construction project. Mama, are you going to help more people like you helped the ladies who came to visit last month? Sarah smiled. The previous month, they had hosted 2 young women who were participating in a survivor support network, former trafficking victims, who were further along in their healing journey, and who occasionally visited to share experiences and offer encouragement to others. Grace had been fascinated by the visitors and had insisted on showing them her favorite hiking trails and teaching them how to feed the chickens. Yes, sweetheart. I'm going to help more people like that. Good, Grace said with the simple certainty of a child who had grown up understanding that helping others was what her family did. Will you still be here for my birthday party? I will be here for every single one of your birthday parties, Sarah promised. No matter what work Mama does, you and Papa Marcus will always be the most important things in my life. That evening, they called Dr. Cameron to accept the position, then spent hours planning how to restructure their lives to accommodate Sarah's new role. Marcus would continue his consulting work with federal agencies, but with better coordination to avoid both of them being away from Grace at the same time. They would install a more sophisticated home office setup for video conferencing and remote training sessions. And they would hire Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter, a college student studying education, to provide additional childcare support when needed. Are you sure about this? Marcus asked as they finalized their plans. Once we commit to this path, our quiet mountain life changes forever. Sarah looked around their cabin, at Grace's artwork covering the refrigerator, at the photographs documenting 5 years of birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that had become precious memories, at the life they had built together from nothing but determination and love. Marcus, our quiet mountain life was never supposed to be an ending, she said. It was supposed to be the beginning. We've healed, we've grown, we've become a family. Now it's time to use what we've learned to help others find their own beginnings. As if summoned by their conversation, Grace appeared in her pajamas, having awakened from a dream and seeking comfort. Marcus scooped her up and settled her on his lap, where she immediately relaxed back into sleep, completely secure in the knowledge that she was safe and loved. Besides, Sarah continued, stroking Grace's hair, the best gift we can give her is showing her that people who've been through hard things can use those experiences to make the world better. That survival isn't enough. The goal is to thrive and help others thrive too. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin that had sheltered them through their transformation from strangers to family. Outside, the mountain night was crisp and clear, full of stars and possibilities, and in that warm circle of light, surrounded by love that had been chosen rather than inherited, they began planning a future that would honor their past while building something larger than themselves, a legacy of healing that would extend far beyond their mountain sanctuary to touch lives they had not yet met, in places they had not yet been, for years to come. The lonely lumberjack who had taken in a pregnant girl sold by her mother had indeed found more than a family. He had found his purpose, his redemption, and his home. And the girl who had been treated as property had become a woman whose voice would speak for the voiceless, whose story would give hope to the hopeless, and whose love would ensure that the cycle of abuse ended permanently with her generation. Some stories end with happiness. Others end with purpose. The best stories, like theirs, end with both, and with the understanding that every ending is really just another beginning, waiting to unfold under stars that have witnessed every human struggle and triumph, and which continue to shine with the promise that dawn always comes, no matter how dark the night has been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.